Okay, thanks for clicking there. We are going to talk about DAFs today, or as Giving Review readers will know, donor advised funds. And we're going to do so. I'm Mike Hartman with the Giving Review, and we're going to talk with Helen Flannery, who is an associate fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies, and Brian Mittendorf, who is the H.P. Wolf Chair in Accounting at The Ohio State University's Fisher College of Business. Each of them write about DAFs, and they often do so as co-authors, including most recently in an article that caught our eye in the Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly about the language that DAFs use in, do I say their marketing materials? We'll talk about this, or on their websites to describe what it is they're up to, about their priorities and the resource flows that they effectuate. So we have a problem, both of you at the beginning. We need to talk about what a DAF is, but very briefly. So assuming some knowledge, if one of you would just want to give me in, I don't know, 10 words or less, what a DAF is, or a DAF account and a DAF provider.
Want me to take that, Brian?
That would be great.
Okay, so I would say a donor advised fund, or DAF, is a financial account, like a bank account, except instead of being managed by a bank, it's managed by a charity, which is called a sponsor. And donors put money into the DAF, they take a tax deduction right away because they're giving the money to charity, and then the sponsor gives the donor broad advisory privileges to recommend grants out from the fund.
Okay, that was pretty good. You might have made 10 seconds there, if not right. Okay. And we can get into the detail. Well, this might be a way to get into the details. Some consider them controversial among those who comment on the nonprofit sector. There might be some controversy about DAFs. Why would that possibly be? They sound great.
I can take that too, Brian, if you'd like. Yes, I would say they're controversial for a few reasons, and these are more important now than ever, I will say, because of how fast they're growing. But to me, they center around issues of money, control, and transparency. So when it comes to money, donors put money into a DAF and they get to take a tax deduction right away, but DAFs have no payout requirement, which means the money doesn't actually have to move out to charity. It can just sit there earning fees for sponsors and earning fees for the investment managers that manage the assets. When it comes to control, even though the donors have technically given the money to a charity when they're giving to DAFs, they still retain practical control over it in many ways, like when and where the grants go. So it's sort of like a mini private foundation where the donor retains control. And then finally, when it comes to transparency, DAFs have next to no disclosure requirements. So they don't have to disclose their major donors, and they only have to disclose their grants in aggregate at the sponsor level. So there's no way for the public to know which accounts are making which grants. And that means that DAFs can make gifts totally transparent or totally anonymous, which makes them great conduits for dark money contributions.
Which would differ from the requirements that apply to a private foundation to the degree a DAF account is used in lieu of creating a private foundation.
Exactly.
Transparent.
Yeah, because private foundations have to say who their major donors are, and so you know where the grants are coming from.
How many DAFs are there in America? DAF providers, I guess I should say. Yeah.
DAF providers, there's well over 2,000, but usually in our papers, we focus on those that are 10% or more of their assets are in their DAF program. So it's usually, Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's around 1,200 sponsors.
And of the top 5 nonprofits in America, how many are DAF providers? I think it's 3.
3.
And
yeah.
And they're getting bigger.
And they're the top 3.
Yeah.
So they're, Fidelity Charitable is the biggest charity in the United States with something like $15 billion in charitable contributions per year. And the closest operating charity is, I think it's the United Way with something like $4 billion.
So in your article, you, I guess, sort of acknowledge or provisionally or initially accept the categorization of DAFs, three categories of DAF providers, I'll keep saying. One of those categories is, as you call it, national sponsors, which is what Fidelity and Schwab, among the other commercial sponsors, would be. We can ask later. Is there, when you say, are all national sponsors commercial sponsors? But let's get to that later. But national sponsors, community foundations, which I think came first, and single issue sponsors. I think of those as ideological sponsors, but not all issues would be ideological. That says more about me than not. But do you guys accept those as three general categories, or is that too simple? Or might there need to be more detail put on that that set of categorizations, or what?
Yeah, I guess we started with those. That was our starting point because it's kind of the most accepted view of them. But it also was in many ways what motivated what we're doing here. Community foundations, the value proposition is pretty clear. Single issue sponsors, like kind of depends on what the single issue is. In many ways, the fastest growing and the largest are these national sponsors. And it's unclear what distinguishes them from one another, from other DAFs or DAF sponsors. And so that's, part of our interest is how do they, competition is not the right word, but how do they distinguish themselves? What differentiates Fidelity from Schwab from your local community foundation? Because they're all offering donor advised funds, and they might seem like a commodity to a donor. And so we're interested in how they distinguish themselves, what makes them different from one another. And then the national sponsor group is the natural one to ask that question in, because it's not clear what already distinguishes them. Like I said, community foundations are community based, and it's very clear how they're different from one another because they're based in different places. The national sponsors, it's a little bit harder to get a feel for that.
They do compete with each other, though, don't they? Schwab competes with Fidelity on the.
Yeah, I mean, they do. I mean, I get the reason I avoided the word competition is because they still are charities, and so they might not like using the language competition, but that was really the framing that brought us here was like, if I'm a donor, how do I distinguish these national sponsors, and why would I choose one over another? And so that's kind of where we thought, in this research, was to start asking the question of, how do they pitch themselves to donors? Is it what they can achieve for you in terms of charitable outcomes, or do they view you as like an investment client?
Yeah.
And so is it client service to them? And we were kind of interested in just agnostically asking, what is it that they're doing? What are they saying to donors?
So how did you go about trying to answer that question or that set of questions?
This is where Helen's magic came in.
You
Things
should
that I didn't think
explain
were
it,
possible,
though.
she finds easy. So
Well, that's very nice of Brian to say. He does the important stat crunching, which I don't get at all. But so we looked at the tax returns of we ended up with about 600 sponsors, I think, and we searched their websites for a set of terms. So anytime we looked at their websites and we found a term that related to tax deductions or donor control of some kind, like over investment or granting choices, we counted that as a donor interest term, and then, or a donor benefit term, we called it. And then anytime we found a term that related to urgency or need or mission or grant making, we counted it as a charitable mission emphasis term. Then we counted up the two kinds of scores, and we created a score called the emphasis measure, which we then applied to all of the different sponsors. So a high score meant you were very highly focused on extrinsic donor benefits outside of charitable giving, and a low score meant you were very focused on charitable mission, getting charitable grants out the door.
So is there too much subjectivity there? I know you published the paper or are going to. You're comfortable with the level of subjectivity or not in that methodology?
Yeah, I don't know if you want to speak to that, Brian.
I mean, so what we started with was like, what do we think are terms that capture these things? But we did, validate this data out of the sample, not to get too into the data stuff, but we validated out of the sample to see is is it capturing what we think we're capturing? And then just to give a sense, and it's I guess hard to describe this in words, but to really get a sense of whether we're capturing what we thought we were capturing, we applied this measure to charities that don't have DAFs
Yeah.
and found out they're really skewed on the side of focusing on mission outcomes. And we applied it to the sample we applied to investment advisors. So the group of companies that are investment advisors, and we saw that they were very client or, what we're calling donor focused, but they're very focused on the extrinsic benefits of serving their clients. And then, so we see these two extremes, and then when we apply it with the DAF sponsors, we see kind of a nice normal distribution around the middle, reflecting the fact that, DAF sponsors are straddling these two worlds. They are serving their clients who are donors, but they're also serving mission outcomes at the same time. So all of those things, I guess, gave us some reassurance that we're capturing something about those trade-offs. And then what we are interested in doing then is saying, let's use that to detect the variability. If some of these sponsors really mostly talk in language about what they can do for the donor versus those that talk about what they can do to achieve outcomes, do they behave differently from one another? Or probably the better way of asking it is, do they attract different types of donors?
Yeah.
In thinking about the three different standard types that we've talked about before, I wouldn't necessarily say that any one of the types is inherently worse or more controversial than the others. I tend to think that controversial is as controversial does, but I do think, in light of your point, that when you have national sponsors that are closely affiliated with investment banks, and you asked about that before, are all nationals commercial sponsors? They're not.
Yeah.
Commercial sponsors are a subset of nationals. But that is a situation where a giving vehicle that is supposed to be a charitable giving vehicle becomes closely intertwined with asset management and portfolio management. And for example, sometimes financial managers at investment firms are bonused on how much money their clients have in their DAFs at their sister sponsor. And then often the DAF portfolios are managed by the investment advisors at the sponsor's sister bank. So I think those are the kinds of things that would raise particular concerns for me, since they can easily lead to conflicts of interest and encourage asset buildup instead of charitably moving money out the door.
So even if this is only a hypothetical question, I guess it's more, well, are there any national sponsors that are like overly concerned with missions? I mean, I'm just asking you to confirm my bias, I guess, but which would,
Yes, yeah, definitely. It's a great question because there are certain sponsors like Amalgamated
yeah,
is technically a national donor advised fund sponsor, but they put a lot of emphasis on their moving their charitable throughput. And they even have a box you can check where it says, I voluntarily pledge to give out 10% or more of my assets each year to charity. So they're very focused on, I don't actually know what their EM score was, so I can't speak
okay.
to it data
It's
wise.
funny,
But
I would have thought amalgamated would be a single issue because I've got that in the ideological part of mine.
ah,
But okay, you had to make judgment calls. Okay. And are there single issue DAFs that seem like they might be, oh, you're going to say, well, look at the scores, Mike, or whatever. Is it
probably.
possible
I can't
a
think of one off the
single
top of my
DAF,
head. Yeah,
yeah, that's overly concerned with the money management? I mean, the
right.
ideological DAFs really are not warehousing, are they? That's a question. Uh, they're pass-through-y. That's a question.
I would suspect so. I don't know off the top of my head, but I do know that our results, and Brian will remember this a lot more than I will, and we might get into this more, but our results were highly predictive for nationals, but also somewhat to a lesser extent, but highly predictive for single issue sponsors as well. So to me, that says there's a very broad range of single issue sponsors and how they behave.
Right. And just to admit how wrongheaded my questions are, there are probably single issue DAFs for like diabetes or health or not even having to do with public policy.
Right.
Okay.
Universities and hospitals and German Shepherd Dog
Yeah.
Association, like there's a gamut.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the community foundations, are they less controversial? You said no before, but I mean, if the geography is the determining is a prime motivation for having the DAF sponsorship thing and giving to it, uh, can one doesn't know whether to think unfairly the way I was, whether it's to money management or to charity, right? Or what can be said of, aren't they exempt from the debate I want to have between whether something's charity or not?
Oh, that's a great question.
I would actually say, like, empirically speaking, in the data,
Yeah.
Right, you say that and then
um,
I'll say it. Yeah.
maybe it's controversial to even say say this, but then on average, the national sponsors pay out at much higher rates than community foundations do.
Oh.
And so if that is your concern, exempting community foundations because theoretically they're behaving less that way. I don't think that's fair. And I see some of the proposals that say we should exempt community foundations. The data doesn't really show that community foundations behave differently in that regard. I think what the data also shows, though, is you see a lot more variability amongst the national sponsors. So I think one thing I would constantly say is comparing the average community foundation to the average national sponsor misses out on the variation. And there's so much more variation amongst national sponsors. Community foundations' behavior is much more predictable.
Mhm.
Um, and I mention this because we also have to start thinking about what we have as data at the sponsor level, but what I would really be interested in is data at the donor or the fund level. And so if you see this variability across national sponsors, it suggests we're going to see huge variability within those sponsors as well. And so when you think about public policy questions, I would be very interested in knowing, what does Congress want? Does Congress want them to behave a certain way on average, or does Congress want to ensure that every donor who gets a deduction is doing enough in a charitable fashion and fast enough? And those are very different questions. And looking at the averages aren't getting at the answer. Okay, so I've rambled enough on that. Helen will have something much more precise here.
No, I thought that was brilliant. And yeah, I guess I would just say, in line with what Brian said, there's a great deal of variability in community foundations. I mean, they're not as much as with the other types, but there are certainly community foundations that have huge DAF programs and behave much more like national DAFs. And then there are other small community foundations that have hardly any DAF program at all.
Yeah.
So
Just are most big community foundations, I assume, have their money being managed by national money management. By the way, maybe Fidelity and Schwab for all I know. But uh, this would, I assume the answer here is, well, we don't know. There's no data on this. But are community foundation DApps being run by community money managers?
this is a great question, because the IRS put out a set of proposed regulations this winter. The most contentious of those proposals was a proposal to tax any money paid from DAFs to donors' personal investment advisors for managing the money in the DAFs. And that proposal, usually when it comes to statutory proposals, it's fought by the big national sponsors.
Sure.
But this proposal was fought by the small community foundations because they said they rely on donors' personal investment advisors a lot for managing the money in the DAFs. So they're highly dependent on that because they don't have investment advisors ready to hand like the investment banks do.
Yeah, yeah.